Your room is just a tiny space, okay? That's enough for you, isn't it? It seems my mother-in-law finds joy in speaking down to me, as she said this with a smirk. I am a working housewife living with my husband, and we have a son. Now that he is employed and independent, when he was just born. I didn't get along well with my mother-in-law. Since then, I had been distant from my in-laws, but one day, without any notice, my husband brought them home. Why did you suddenly bring your father and mother? Oh, I decided we should live together to take care of them. I was dumbfounded by his unilateral decision. Then, he made an even more outrageous statement. Oh, and we're going to remodel the house. We need to make rooms for my parents too. And so, my mother-in-law condescendingly said I would be fine in a small room. It was then that the commander in my head decided it was time to separate from this family. Fine. Then, I'm divorcing a husband who earns $7.92 an hour. Upon my declaration, my father-in-law smirked and finally spoke. Don't joke like that. What's so funny? Whether he believes it or not is up to him, but he will understand soon enough. My words are no joke, and neither is my resolve. My name is Janet, I am 49 years old. I live with my husband Greg and I've been working at my family's factory since graduating from university. Our relationship started back in our university days. We were in the same seminar and talked only about necessary academic stuff, rarely seeing each other socially. However, in our senior year, we began to consult more about our thesis, which led to us getting along and starting to date after graduation. Things progressed smoothly, and we married. Now, we have a son who is a working adult. He moved out to start his independent life, but still meets us once or twice a month. He grew up to be considerate, celebrating our birthdays every year, and sending gifts on Father's Day and Mother's Day, which makes me very happy. He's a wonderful son, but I had my grievances against Greg and my in-laws. They are now in their late 70s and live near our home instead of living with us or staying at a nursing facility, but we don't really interact much. Hey, let's consider living with my parents soon. They're getting old, and it worries me. Greg brings this up from time to time, but I never agreed. Every time he mentions his parents, I recall my past conflicts with my mother-in-law, which dampens my spirits. How long are you going to hold on to the past? We're adults now, it's time to let it go and start taking care of my parents properly. Every time the topic of living together comes up, it creates tension between us. And it ends with him getting angry and the issue unresolved. I have a feud with them, or rather with my mother-in-law. No matter how often I am yelled at by him. My troubles began because of Greg and my mother-in-law. So, I cannot accept it. I am amazed they dare to say such things after how they've treated me. My relationship with my in-laws wasn't always bad. Initially, we had a good relationship. Janet, let's go out together. I want to go clothes shopping. If she invited me on a weekend, I would go with her. And we even chatted over coffee on our way back. When I traveled, I always brought back souvenirs. And they would give us vegetables and fruits, indicating we were once close. This changed after my son was born. Facing my first childbirth and parenting, I struggled but was committed. I wanted to make my son happy. However, it seemed like Greg never truly became aware of his role as a father. During my pregnancy and even after the birth, he hardly did anything. He yelled at me to cook quickly when I was immobilized by morning sickness. Even when I said I was worried about carrying heavy things, he would insist. Or make me change a light bulb where I felt unstable. When our son cried at night, Greg wouldn't help with feeding, changing diapers, or comforting him. Why won't you help at all? He's our child, you should be more involved in parenting. And I need more help with the housework too. I once cried out in frustration during a moment of emotional instability. But it seemed to have no impact on him. Why should I have to do housework? He looked at me irritably and said that. Moreover, if I hadn't finished cleaning or preparing a meal by the time Greg got home, he would say, "You're so inefficient. A wife who can't do housework. What a failure. Take care of things around me, you useless woman." Here I was, overwhelmed with a small son who needed constant attention. I couldn't possibly take care of a fully grown adult too. Each time Greg criticized me, it felt like thorns were piercing my heart. Not only Greg but also my mother-in-law became a source of stress too. "Janet can't handle it alone, so I'll take care of raising the successor properly," she would boast and frequently visit our home. It might have been well-intentioned, but it was an annoyance for me. "Everything you do is wrong, Janet. Redo it all." She would nitpick everything I did, and together with Greg, they started blaming me. "Greg is right, you're completely failing as a wife. Right? Please, try to do better." Even when I sought help with my gaze from my father-in-law amidst their eerie smiles, he continued to show complete indifference. He never intervened nor showed any affection towards his grandson. I felt increasingly isolated in my in-laws' household, with no one to turn to. The only thing that kept me from breaking was the support from my parents and siblings. While appreciating them, I gritted my teeth and endured the tough days. However, one day, Greg's company started downsizing due to poor performance. And he was included in the layoffs. Although I also worked, supporting the expenses for us three on my own was challenging. When I discussed that, my parents helped us and I barely managed to support our finances. I felt guilty always relying on them. Since Greg had difficulty finding a new job for a while after his layoff, I introduced him to work at my family's factory. My father runs a manufacturing plant for special parts. And it was decided Greg would work there part-time. I'm truly indebted to my parents and siblings. Even as our lives became tougher, my mother-in-law's harassment escalated. "We don't need a useless daughter-in-law like you." The days of being ridiculed like that continued, and I often thought about leaving. However, I resisted for the sake of not depriving my son of his father. As time passed and my son grew up, my mother-in-law's visits decreased. Apparently, she disliked that my teenage son no longer listened to her during his rebellious phase. Although it irked me, the fewer encounters with her were a relief. The absence of her visits, which had possibly been my massive stress, even improved my health. I even felt impressed with a peaceful life without her interference. Although I became distant from my in-laws, Greg still visited them frequently. However, my worries weren't entirely gone. Greg remained a part-time worker, and I continued to support our finances. One holiday, as I was relaxing at home, the entrance became unusually noisy. Then, heavy footsteps approached. Greg was supposed to be at work. Could it be a burglar? As I braced myself, the living room door opened, and I was shocked to see Greg, who was supposed to have gone to work, bringing his parents home. "What about work? And why did you suddenly bring your father and mother?" "Oh, I decided we should live together to take care of them." "What? What do you mean? Why did you decide that on your own?" I whispered so that my in-laws couldn't hear, but Greg looked puzzled. As if I was saying something unreasonable. "You wouldn't move forward with the cohabitation. So I had to bring them here." "You wouldn't say something as terrible as kicking them out, right?" Continually faced with his unreasonable demands, I felt a headache coming on. My in-laws boldly sat on the sofa, changing the TV channel with the remote. No matter what I said, they wouldn't listen. Yet, I couldn't let them stay. The abusive words my mother-in-law had once said played unwantedly in my head. Living together would mean daily stress like before. I feared I might lose my sanity. Oh, we're also going to remodel the house. We need to make rooms for my parents. Are you serious? Ignoring my astonishment, Greg shared a laugh with his parents. He might feel good about taking care of them, but inside, I was in turmoil. What's the big deal? It's only natural to take care of one's parents. As my wife, you should do your part. As he spoke, my mother-in-law nodded in agreement, pleased. I felt disheartened and pinched the bridge of my nose. Trying not to lose my composure in front of my in-laws, though it seemed impossible. We'll even build a tiny space just for you, Janet. That should be enough, right? Time had passed, but my mother-in-law hadn't changed for the better. Convinced that living together would start a hellish life, something inside me snapped. Who's paying for the remodel? Prompted by my unexpectedly stern voice, Greg was momentarily speechless. Well, that would be Greg, of course. His mother answered instead, but what she said made me tilt my head. There was no way Greg, still a part-timer, could afford such an expense. Did his parents not know about his job or our financial situation? Noticing my skeptical look, Greg quickly spoke up. Of course. After all, I'm the head of the household. That's right. While she smiled happily at his words, I felt both disappointed and hollow. What head of the household? Such lies would surely be exposed eventually. Fine. Then I'm divorcing a husband who earns $7.92 an hour. I can't deal with you anymore. Hey, what are you saying? What? What do you mean by $7.92 an hour? I continued to speak in place of him, who was in a panic because he didn't want that fact to be revealed. He had always belittled the factory work and never made an effort. Remaining a part-timer with a low hourly wage due to his unserious work attitude and his low ability. Despite my repeated pleas to take his job seriously, he ignored them. He couldn't possibly afford the remodeling expenses. And since they made the decision without me, I owed them nothing. Hearing that, my mother-in-law and Greg fell silent, but my father-in-law smirked. What's so funny? I wondered. As I pondered that, my father-in-law, who had until now remained silent, finally spoke up. Don't joke like that. When he said that, my mother-in-law regained her composure and taunted. She probably couldn't imagine that her own son had no money. Surely you jest. After all, you're living off Greg. The truth would reveal itself in time. I left them without another word, headed home, and called my son. I'm sorry, I've decided to divorce your father. While I didn't go into the details, my son seemed to instantly sense something. I see. You've been enduring all this time, haven't you, Mom? You don't have to bear it anymore. His gentle voice almost made me cry, but I managed to hold back my tears and thanked him. He might have noticed that my voice was shaking. However, until we hung up, he didn't mention it. Feeling resolute, I sent the divorce papers to Greg. A few days later, he called me. Are you kidding me? What's this divorce paper about? I was not joking at all. I was utterly serious. No matter what he said, this was the manifestation of my decision to divorce. He was noisy, but it came at a good time. I was discussing with my lawyer, so I decided to call him in. However, Greg didn't come alone but with his parents for some reason. It seemed like their presence would complicate things, and I sighed. I had already made up my mind about the divorce. So I was not going to pretend or be swayed by them anymore. I got this sent to me, but I have no intention of divorcing. Greg tried to thrust the divorce papers back at me, but I had no intention of taking them. But his parents seemed to have different opinions, and my mother-in-law mockingly said, "What are you talking about? Just get a divorce quickly." My father-in-law didn't say anything, but he was nodding and smirking to show his agreement. My prediction that things would get complicated was spot on. They tried to talk about dividing property, saying, "We can't give Greg's precious assets to a woman like you," making it impossible to have a proper discussion. Every time I tried to speak, my in-laws would spout selfish nonsense and interrupt. My in-laws had always been self-centered. But they had become even more stubborn with age and wouldn't listen to reason. Even Greg seemed overwhelmed and made no effort to stop them. The lawyer as well as I tried to get them to listen, but to no avail. Eventually, we decided not to divide the property. However, this marked the first step in my in-laws' downfall. In fact, my family has been wealthy since my grandfather's generation, owning not just one but several large factories. My grandfather, the founder, had given shares to his children and grandchildren to ensure they wouldn't struggle financially in the future. Moreover, when Greg was laid off, my parents, worried about me, hired me in a managerial position and gave me additional shares. Thanks to this, my annual income was about $1 million, including dividends. Conversely, Greg had saved nothing, so honestly, not dividing the property was more advantageous for me. If he had listened properly, maybe there could have been another way. I never expressed this thought in front of him, though. Thus, we divorced. The following day, after what could hardly be called a discussion, Greg came to work as usual. However, something was off. Not working was typical for him, but he unusually clung to me. "Please, let's start over. I can't do anything without you, Janet. I only said we'd divorce because of my parents." Incredibly, he began to cry and wail without regard for others. His behavior resembled that of a child throwing a tantrum in a supermarket because he couldn't get candy. It was unbearable to watch that from a grown man. "Call off the divorce. Please. Excuse me, you're in the way. I can't work like this. I won't leave this spot until you say you'll stop the divorce." He kept being selfish, disrupting my work. Other employees around us looked confused and didn't know what to do. There were those whose tasks depended on my instructions. And his behavior was not just disrupting me but the entire workplace. I took a deep breath. I couldn't let this continue to hinder our operations. I decided to use my authority to fire him. Of course, that wasn't just to handle the situation temporarily. In fact, his conduct at work had long been problematic. He often took extended breaks. When corrected something, he would lash out verbally. There were numerous complaints from other employees. Moreover, he inherently had a habit of slacking off, repeatedly arriving late or not showing up at all, even though he was only scheduled to work 3 days a week. Despite my warnings, there was no improvement. I had become so accustomed to his behavior that I usually let it slide, but that day he was late again. It was probably no surprise that he had been laid off from his previous job. "You are fired. Your presence here only disrupts the workflow, so please leave immediately. Oh, and you'll need to move out of the house we shared too." That house was actually in my name, and I had intended to evict him once we divorced. As I delivered this information calmly, his tears, which had momentarily stopped, began to flow again. His face became a mess with tears and a running nose. I looked away from him. There was no more mercy to offer. I wanted him to realize how much trouble he had caused all that time. Realizing that his dismissal was irreversible, Greg reluctantly left the factory. But the storm was far from over. The following day, my mother-in-law showed up at the workplace. "Cancel Greg's dismissal, please. You can't just decide this based on your personal feelings, can you?" It wasn't based solely on personal feelings. I had made sure to explain that, but either she wasn't listening, or perhaps she refused to believe her son could have such poor work behavior. No matter what I said, my mother-in-law seemed unlikely to be convinced. So, I decided to call Greg and my father-in-law and have another discussion with the lawyer present, with Greg looking utterly disheartened and barely speaking. His parents appeared more subdued than before. They watched Greg anxiously, their mouths twitching as if they wanted to say something. First, let me explain. I am an executive managing the factory. I closely monitor the employees' behavior, and based on that, I made the decision to fire Greg. After explaining how I had been supporting the household financially, my in-laws finally seemed to take what I was saying seriously. Is that true, Greg? It seemed more like they believed me because Greg nodded, rather than understanding my explanation themselves. I was a bit irritated, but it was far better than them causing a scene like before. Wait, what about the remodeling? You mean Greg can't pay for it? Oh dear, we've already paid the deposit and the construction has started. My mother-in-law's face turned pale as she screamed in a near frenzy. Both my in-laws had relied on his earnings to pay the rest of the remodeling costs. They had used all their modest retirement savings for the remodeling deposit. They probably didn't know that the house was in my name. With their savings gone and the dream of living with their son shattered, my in-laws had to put up their own home for sale to scrape together living expenses. Afterwards, Greg and his parents rented a cheap, small apartment where they lived together. Greg remained unemployed and seemed to have become a recluse. He was in his 40s, which might have made it difficult for him to find a new job. My in-laws, who had been living on a pension, started to struggle financially. Please, lend us some money. We can't make ends meet. They began asking everyone around for money, causing more and more people to distance themselves, starting with the neighbors and even stopping passers-by on the street in front of their apartment. Their behavior bordered on harassment. It wouldn't be surprising if they were flagged as suspicious. With that behavior, even continuing to pay the rent on their apartment seems doubtful. Greg isn't working, and a pension isn't enough to cover expenses for 3 people. They might be evicted again, but that's no longer my concern. I enjoy living alone, focusing on my work. As for the house, they had started remodeling without my consent. I decided to continue paying for the construction. I felt somewhat responsible to the workers, and since the work had already started, it had to be completed to make the house livable. Of course, I'm going to cancel the remodeling plan set by my in-laws and change it to a house more to my liking. Creating several guest rooms seems like a good idea, and having my son, my parents, and siblings stay over will be enjoyable. I spend my days off excitedly planning the new design for the house, eager to erase the bad memories of living with Greg and start anew.